Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Somebody by the name of Stephen Hall stopped by this morning, and he has written a book with an interesting and challenging title. It's called Wisdom, From Philosophy to Neuroscience, published by our friends at Alfred A. Knopf. I thank you for coming by.
My pleasure being here.
I read something, however, in your book, opening Chapter 3, that raises a question. The question is, how did you write the book? Now, I'll tell you why I asked you that question. I'm going to quote from Nicholas of Cusa. Now, Nicholas of Cusa, for those of you who don't remember Nick, is a 15th century canon lawyer, diplomat, philosopher, and German bishop. And he says about wisdom, "Of wisdom, therefore, which all men by nature desires to know and seek with such mental application, one can know only that it is higher than all knowledge, and thus unknowable, unutterable in any words, unintelligible to any intellect, unmeasurable by any measure, unlimitable by any limit, unaffirmable by any affirmation, undeniable by any negation, indubitable by any doubt, and no opinion can be held about it." Now, with Nicholas telling you that, why did you write this book?
I think part of that is because Nicholas was from the 15th century, where one might have accepted limitation of knowledge and learning that I think we don't accept in quite the same way today. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what he wrote, in the sense that this is such a big topic. It touches us in so many different ways, in many respects. Very difficult to get our arms around, either conceptually, scientifically, philosophically. What wisdom is and what its meaning is something that's really concerned philosophy for 2,500 years. So there are no easy answers to the question. However, the question is worth asking.
It sure is. And in your anecdote about how you really got into writing the book, you confessed that when it was first proposed to you, you said, huh?
This originally came up because I was asked to do an article for the New York Times Magazine in 2006 about wisdom research. My editor said that they had heard there was wisdom research, and they were doing a special issue on baby boomers getting old. And my initial reaction was, this must be a load of baloney. Because I write about real science and hard science.
Yeah. Well, and then you got into it, and it captured you, I think.
I think wisdom is fascinating to all of us because it speaks to the big decisions we make and choices we make about our lives. You know, how we look into the future, how we shepherd our families into the future, the decisions we make that may involve self-sacrifice to benefit those in our group, including the family, however you want to define group. It really goes to the heart of the what we decide is important and the decisions that we then make about what is important. Yeah.
The other thing that I must say about the book is that it fulfills the subtitle. I mean, it is terribly, terribly comprehensive. And you've done an incredible job here.
It's impossible to cover the waterfront when it comes to wisdom. It's a waterfront that never ends. But I did want to talk about the early philosophical musings, in part because science and scientists today, and really when I say today, I mean in the last 5 years, have been doing experiments designed to answer questions that were raised by Socrates, that were raised by John Stuart Mill, questions that have been raised by philosophy for 2,500 years. They're actually being addressed in experiments now about how the brain handles conflict, moral dilemmas, decisions, this sort of thing.
It's amazing.
It's incredible.
It's an absolutely amazing thread of the book that you can, jump, as it were, from Socrates to neuroscience, and there's something going on there.
Well, it's not only that I'm jumping, it's that the scientists are jumping. As I mentioned in the book, Typically a scientific article has citations at the end of, scientists who have done similar work in the field. And you're now starting to see citations of work by Aristotle, Montaigne, John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, David Hume. These are all philosophers who really, Kant, people really wrestled with the idea of wisdom over the course of history. And now neuroscientists are citing them as influences in how they're approaching their experimental work.
Among the philosophers, if you will, featured in the book, Socrates, Confucius, Christ, Buddha, there's a kind of a common tragic thread to their lives.
Well,
does that mean wisdom is dangerous?
Well, one of the interesting things that occurred to me is that often figures of wisdom are seen as adversarial to their particular time. So if you take the example of Jesus, if you take the example of Socrates, Confucius to a lesser extent, but also the Buddha, these were people who were not welcomed by their societies, but in fact ostracized by them. Socrates was put to death. Confucius really couldn't find gainful employment despite the breadth of his knowledge. Jesus obviously was persecuted. And if you look at more recent figures who have been associated with wisdom, people like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, they too, motivated by a deep vein both of compassion and social justice, which I think runs through the earlier figures, nonetheless were in opposition to society.
Yeah, that's one of the things that struck me is that wisdom is active. It's not sitting around and thinking about things. It's sitting around thinking about things and then taking some kind of action.
Well, I think wisdom prepares you for action, and I think it prepares you to take the best decision. But wisdom without decision-making or action is kind of an empty pursuit.
Aha. That's very interesting. The thing that we want to look at when we come back is one of the great charms of wisdom from philosophy to neuroscience. And that is that it introduces us to a number of fascinating people. I think that's because this guy's a journalist at heart. And we'll meet one of them when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Wisdom from Philosophy to Neuroscience. Great title, wonderful book. Stephen Hall, the author, is with us, and the book is published by Alfred A. Knopf. I always say Alfred A. Knopf. I feel I should have respect for Alfred. I really do. Sherwin Newland had some interesting things to say about your book. With erudition and literary skill, Stephen Hall brings us a powerful and perceptive synthesis of the contributions made by philosophers, theologians, and 21st century scientists to humankind's ages-old search for the sources of wisdom. As a work of insight and art, this is indeed a wise book. Now, one of the things that this wise book brought me to at the end was that if you're seeking a simple, all-purpose definition of wisdom, you ain't going to get it. You ain't going to get it in this book, and you're just not going to get it ever, because that's not what wisdom is about. Wisdom is about quest, never-ending, kind of.
Absolutely. I think the distinction, and I sometimes talk about this, the distinction between intelligence, for example, and wisdom is that if you test someone's intelligence, there are correct answers to the various questions that you're asking. But and psychologists have actually tried to do that. When you test for wisdom, there are no correct answers. And I think what that's telling us is that there's not one-size-fits-all kind of description or definition of what it is. So much of it involves understanding the context of a situation and arriving at a decision that is absolutely appropriate in that situation, but might be disastrous in a different situation.
Yeah, this whole notion that when you're looking at wisdom, there are no right answers. That really shook me up.
In a sense, it's actually very tied to evolution in the way that our brains probably evolved to be able to deal with or adapt to changing circumstances. Because, like all biological organisms, we live in a world that doesn't stay the same all the time. Obviously, if food availability changes, all sorts of things change. And a nimble brain has to be able to understand the change. So in that sense, I think wisdom is very much in line with that kind of biological adaptability. And evolution provided us with this incredible machine called the brain that does a fantastic job of adjusting.
Yeah, the first science, I guess, if you will, that tackled wisdom in a scientific way was psychology. And the godmother of it all is a woman by the name of Vivian Clayton. And Vivian felt that wisdom represented knowledge that was, by contrast perhaps with intelligence, profoundly social, deeply personal, adaptive, and intuitive.
That's correct.
What a godmother.
She was the first one who published any kind of even faintly scientific or rigorous research on the notion of wisdom. And interestingly, in working toward her definition that she used in her testing, she went to the Old Testament. She went to the 5 books of Moses, basically, and read through the biblical stories of judges, how they were trained, how they were respected in their societies, how they rendered judgment. And that was actually a very guiding principle in her early notions of wisdom.
Another pioneer, and I'll probably mispronounce his name, Paul Baltez?
Baltez, yeah. Baltez,
who is, I guess, the founder of the Berlin Wisdom Project.
That's correct. He was a very prominent lifespan developmental psychologist, meaning someone who's studied how people evolved over the course of their lifetime in terms of their psychology, their emotions, their cognition. And he initially began studying older people, which is the Berlin Aging Project, ultimately became the Berlin Wisdom Project, because they realized that older people had accumulated a sense of wisdom, a sense of knowledge that enabled them in certain situations to come up with what the Baltez group considered wise decisions and wise resolutions.
Not pioneering, perhaps, but I think one thing that I really think we should mention, because it's very important, is the work being done right now at Stanford University by Laura Carstensen and her associates. And this is especially around the issue of age and wisdom.
Yeah. And it's a little bit more particular in that it's actually about how older people, compared to younger people, essentially regulate or manage their emotion.
Their emotions, yeah.
And the notion being that, and the findings basically being that older people, for a variety of reasons, seem to have a better thermostat for readjusting their emotional temperature when they encounter adversity, things that upset them. It's clear that emotional relationships, like family-related things, are more important and therefore are preserved from this point of view. She's actually compared it, unlike a lot of other research, to younger people. And she's shown that by psychological measure, but also by brain scanning experiments, older people seem not to hold on to negativity or sort of dwell on negative events as much as young people, at least judging by the activity that's going on inside their brains.
And she also points out in the studies, I think, if I remember correctly, that in their social activities, the older persons are not trying to acquire. They're more at ease.
By that point in life, you're still acquiring knowledge, but you don't have this hell-bent drive to acquire knowledge. And there's been other work, not by her, but she's very familiar with it, which shows that older people seem to have this knack for kind of day-to-day problem solving that exceeds that of younger people. And a lot of it, again, is driven by this emotional regulation and ability to be even-handed.
Wisdom from philosophy to neuroscience, reports on experiments undertaken to better understand something called neural pillars, which we'll find out about when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast, wisdom from philosophy to neurosciences. The title, Stephen Hall is the author, and the publisher is Alfred Knopf. David Schenck has some nice words to say about this book. Wisdom, he writes, is a golden ticket tour of the human mind in all its dimensions, led by one of the most insightful and trustworthy science journalists we've ever had. This book is a feast, not a snack. Get ready to digest more smart brain science than you ever thought possible. Now, the brain science is presented to us within the framework of these pillars, these 8 neural pillars of wisdom. And that is a construct that you've come up with in order to separate out the research?
Yeah, I kind of was inspired, obviously, by the 7 pillars of wisdom from the Bible. And as it turned out, I sort of found 8 areas. But basically what it represents is areas of very active neuroscientific research going on today, brain science, that is focused on particular aspects of human thought or human emotion that I think are very resonant with notions and ideas of wisdom. So I think it sort of feeds into our idea of what constitutes wisdom.
And when I think of it, the thing that really captured me was the measurement of compassion through observing the correlation between a deep state of meditation and changes in the EEG activity of the brain, which the meditator focuses on. And this is incredible. But you were there.
It is amazing. And I think what's really interesting about it is it tells us that if by focus, by effort, by exertion, we can really change the activity of our brain. It's a kind of exercise mentally that's analogous to physical exercise in building up a muscle. In this case, the muscle happens to be the brain.
And you write in conclusion of your description of the experiment, at the risk of sounding credulous, if not downright corny, the electrical activity measured by dozens of electrodes plastered all over Richard's noggin seemed in remarkable harmony.
And that's exactly
and that's the sign of compassion, the harmony?
Well, it's this notion that with compassion, with advanced compassion, there's an integration of activity throughout the brain. In other words, it's kind of coordinated. And they've broken down a kind of circuit that seems to be involved in compassion, one of which is perceiving suffering in another person. And then feeling that suffering in oneself, kind of a somatic reaction to it, and then doing something about it. So by the definition that they're working on, they can see a circuit in the brain that goes from perception and feeling to action, to relieving suffering. It's really pretty impressive.
And it's really within the Buddhist understanding of wisdom, because he, the fellow who is the subject, Matthew Ricard, he says that Buddhism, there are 2 aspects of wisdom, which we've been talking to. One has to do with discerning the nature of reality, and then the other one has to do with doing something.
Exactly. And, there's a great parallel, of course, to loving kindness in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. So you see this is one of these convergence or congruences among different philosophies that I think is getting investigated in a very interesting way in terms of brain science and how it works.
It's amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. Is there any one of the areas that you found particularly fascinating besides compassion? I mean, in a sense, you found them all fascinating, but
in science in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big push to understand altruism, which is a very interesting activity, because it essentially means that you sacrifice self-interest for the greater interest of a group. And indeed, once again, a sort of circuitry of altruism and altruistic behavior has been identified in the brain. It's very closely related to social justice. Gets back to the judges in the Bible. So there are these threads that run through this literally from the Bible to modern brain science.
Somewhere I probably said something like, you can read this book and you're not going to define wisdom, because wisdom is essentially a quest. And however, I think toward the end of the book, you come up with a cursive definition of wisdom that I find very, very satisfactory. And I'd like you to share that with us.
Toward the end of the book, I actually talk about my father's death and thinking about it. And so I recounted a little bit of his history as being a soldier in World War II, having been injured, and then I conclude in this way. As we reviewed the events and values of his life, as families do when they lose a loved one, I realized that he embodied, in his typically quiet and modest way, many of the values that form the behavioral foundation of wisdom. Immense patience, the fearless aggregation of knowledge, a principled compassion not only for humans but for animals, a moral judgment and sense of fairness that must have been cast in a foundry, and an other-centeredness that allowed all his intellectual energies and emotional resources to be poured into the single most important project in his life, his family. We are culturally conditioned to think of wisdom in Lincoln-esque or Solomonic terms, but in terms of day-to-day, lifelong impact, it is hard to imagine a grander achievement on life's stage than to have been a wise parent.
The voice is Stephen Hall. The book, Wisdom, From Philosophy to Neuroscience. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.